The story of resilience does not begin with victory, it begins with pain. Long before she became known as Grandma, to her children, grandchildren, and the many women she would inspire, she was simply a little girl in a village where survival itself was a daily battle. She was born in a time when women's voices were faint, drowned out by the weight of tradition and poverty. The house she grew up in was not one of comfort. It was a mud brick shelter, its walls cracked by heat in the summer and soaked by rains in the monsoon. At night, when the winds howled through the gaps in the roof, she often lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls, wondering if life had anything better in store for her. Her father was a farmer, a man whose back bent over the soil from dawn to dusk. Her mother worked endlessly, raising the children, managing the household, and helping in the fields when needed. There was no luxury of rest. Every pair of hands had a duty. Even as a child, she learned to fetch water from the well, gather firewood from the outskirts of the village, and help her mother cook meals for the family. Childhood, for her, was not about games or toys. It was about survival. But even in those struggles, she carried a quiet strength. Unlike the other girls in the village who quickly accepted their fate, she was a dreamer. Her eyes often wandered toward the horizon, where the sky melted into the fields. She imagined a life where women could walk with their heads held high, where they weren't just shadows behind the men but stood proudly in the sunlight. Her first lessons in resilience came early. At the age of 9, she lost her younger brother to illness. There were no proper doctors in the village, no medicine beyond herbal remedies and whispered prayers. She sat by his side, holding his tiny hand, watching helplessly as his breath grew weaker until it was gone. That day, she learned what loss meant. She saw her mother break down for the first time, and though she was only a child, she decided she would not let sorrow destroy her. The days that followed were harder. Food became scarcer as her father struggled with failed crops. There were days when the family ate nothing but bread and salted water. Yet, instead of breaking, she found ways to keep going. She learned to stitch torn clothes, to barter vegetables in the village market, and to comfort her younger siblings with bedtime stories made from her imagination. Her village did not believe much in educating girls. "What use is reading and writing for a daughter?" the elders often said. "She will belong to another household one day. Better she learns to cook and sew." But she was different. She longed for knowledge. Whenever her elder brother came home from the small village school, she would secretly peek into his books. By the dim light of a kerosene lamp, she traced the letters with her fingers, whispering them softly until she memorized them. One evening, her father caught her holding the book. Instead of scolding her, he looked at her determined eyes and sighed. "You are not like the others," he said quietly. "You want more from life." She nodded, though she did not yet understand what more meant. This hunger for learning became her silent rebellion. It gave her strength through the long hours of chores, through the exhaustion of carrying water jars twice her size, through the loneliness of being misunderstood. By the time she turned 13, life's burdens had already carved themselves into her shoulders. She was expected to grow up fast, to take on responsibilities that should never belong to a child. Yet, instead of becoming bitter, she became stronger. There was a fire in her heart, a fire that would one day light the way for countless others. But for now, she was still just a girl in a forgotten corner of the world, learning the language of suffering, shaping her spirit with each hardship. What no one knew then was that this little girl would become a woman who, through her strength, her resilience, and her unyielding courage, would inspire generations to come. The years after her childhood were filled with both transformation and sacrifice. The little girl who once stared at the horizon with dreams of something bigger now had to grow up quickly. Too quickly, some might say. But for her, this wasn't a burden. It was survival. By the time she turned 16, she was no longer just a child. Her face had matured, her hands were calloused from years of hard work, and her eyes, those eyes that had once searched the sky for answers, now focused on the needs of her family. Her father's health had begun to decline, weakened by years of overworking the fields, and the weight of his responsibilities had shifted onto her. Her mother, although strong, was now too tired to carry on alone. It was up to her to help make the food, take care of the younger children, and manage the household. She didn't complain. She had never learned how to. Instead, she woke up early every day, tending to the cattle, cleaning the house, and making sure everyone was fed before she even thought of herself. There was no longer any room for childish whims. She had responsibilities, and she was determined to carry them all. She became an expert at balancing the needs of her family with the relentless demands of daily life. Every evening, when she finally sat down to rest, her body would ache with exhaustion, but her mind stayed sharp, her heart unbroken. During this time, a marriage proposal came from a man in a neighboring village. He was a well-to-do farmer, and though he was older than her, his offer seemed like a good way to secure the family's future. It was a traditional arrangement, one that she had been preparing for her whole life, even if she didn't fully understand it. Her mother was thrilled, seeing this as an opportunity for her daughter to escape the unrelenting hardship of their home. But for the young woman, there was a lingering doubt. She didn't want to be bound by an agreement that left her own dreams behind. Yet, when the proposal was brought before her, there was no room for refusal. She was expected to say yes. It was in that moment that she realized something profound, that although life might offer her few choices, she still had the power to choose how she responded to them. This marriage, this life, might be handed to her, but it was her spirit that would decide how it would unfold. So she agreed. And as her wedding day approached, she did what she had always done. She put aside her personal feelings and focused on the family. She spent the days preparing, not just for her own future, but for the future of those she loved. But marriage, as she would soon find out, was not an escape. It was another set of trials, another challenge to her strength and resilience. Her new husband was not the kind of man who appreciated her independence. Though he was kind in his way, he expected her to perform the traditional role of a wife: cooking, cleaning, bearing children, and being obedient. For the first time in her life, she felt trapped. But she didn't give in to despair. Instead, she became the woman her husband needed her to be: dutiful, hardworking, and ever-present. Yet there was always a part of her that yearned for more. More than just being someone's wife. More than just being a mother. She wanted to carve out her own identity, one not defined by anyone else's expectations but her own. Over the next few years, she bore children, one after another. Each birth was painful, both physically and emotionally, but it also marked a new chapter in her life. She learned to love fiercely, to protect her children with everything she had, to shield them from the hardships she had faced growing up. In them, she saw the promise of a better future, a future she would work tirelessly to create for them. But motherhood didn't make her forget the dreams she had once held. It only fueled them further. When her youngest was old enough to walk, she found a small window of time each day to read the books her brother had brought home years ago. She studied them, not just for knowledge, but to feed the hunger inside her that never went away. The village knew her as the hardworking wife and mother, the woman who always seemed to be carrying the weight of the world. But what they didn't see was the fire that still burned within her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. And as the years went on, she found small ways to keep that fire alive. She joined the local women's group, where they shared their stories, laughed, and cried together. Though it was small, this group became a lifeline. It reminded her that she was not alone. There were other women like her, women who, despite the limitations imposed on them, found ways to carve out moments of joy, of growth, of sisterhood. She listened to their stories of suffering, of dreams unfulfilled, and she began to see a pattern. The women in her village were strong, but they had been silenced. The world outside their small community may have been changing, but in the hearts of these women, there was a quiet rebellion, a rebellion that didn't scream but whispered in the spaces between words. And so, slowly, quietly, she began to change her role in the community. She started teaching the younger girls to read, to write, and to dream. She didn't tell them to fight against the world. They had their own battles, but she showed them that they didn't have to accept everything as it was. She couldn't change her past, She couldn't erase the years of sacrifice and pain. But she could change the future for the girls who looked up to her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. But as with all things, life had its own plans. And the road ahead would require more strength than she could ever anticipate. Life has a way of shaping us, of testing the very fiber of our being, and for her, the trial was about to come in a form far more cruel than anything she had faced before. Just as she began to believe that perhaps, at last, she could find a moment of peace, life took yet another turn, testing her resilience to its very limits. It all began with her husband's health. The hard-working man she had once married had grown frail over the years, his body worn down by decades of laboring in the fields. The signs had been subtle at first, unexplained fatigue, an occasional cough that never seemed to go away, but she had dismissed them as the result of age and hard work. After all, what else could it be? Men of their village rarely saw doctors, believing that ailments were either cured by rest or were simply part of life. But then came a day when he could no longer rise from bed. His body had given out. It was not just weakness, it was something deeper, something far more sinister. The diagnosis came with the kind of brutality that only life's harshest realities bring. It was a rare disease, one that took hold of his body from the inside, silently at first, and then with a force that would not let go. It left him bedridden, unable to perform even the simplest of tasks. The man who had once been a pillar of strength was now a shadow of himself, and she was left to care for him with no help in sight. Her responsibilities doubled, then tripled. She continued to manage the house, tend to the children, and work the fields, all while caring for her ailing husband. The physical labor was nothing new to her. She had grown accustomed to the weight of her duties. But the emotional strain, watching the man she had loved deteriorate before her eyes, was a wound that no amount of work could heal. As the weeks passed, her husband grew weaker, his mind clouded by fever and pain. There were nights when he would call out to her in distress, unable to remember who she was, unable to remember the life they had built together. She would sit beside him, holding his hand, whispering stories of the days when they were young, when they would dream together, as if in some way it might bring him back to her. But the days grew longer, and the hope that things would get better started to fade. Then one fateful evening it happened. Her husband passed away quietly in his sleep. She had been there, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall one last time. In that moment, there was a strange stillness that washed over her. She could hear the quiet night air, the distant rustle of leaves, but there was no sound from the man beside her. A part of her had known that it was coming, yet nothing could have prepared her for the sharpness of the loss. The grief was suffocating. The next few days were a blur. The village mourned with her, as was customary, but the truth was, no one really understood the depth of what she had lost. She had been his caretaker, his support, and now she was alone. Her children, still too young to fully comprehend, clung to her, seeking solace in her strength, while she, in turn, tried to hold herself together for them. But the weight of it all, raising them alone, dealing with the farm, the community's expectations, her own shattered heart, began to crush her. For a time, she considered giving up. There were days when she didn't want to rise from bed, when the grief felt too overwhelming to bear. She thought of the life they had planned, of the dreams they had shared, and the future that now seemed so uncertain. She wondered if she was capable of handling it all, of being both mother and father, of being the strong woman everyone expected her to be. But then something changed. It was in the quiet moments after the funeral, when everything seemed to have returned to normal, that she realized something profound. She realized that she could not allow herself to crumble. Not for her husband, not for the village, but for her children. Her children needed her. In the weeks that followed, she slowly pulled herself out of the fog of grief. It wasn't easy. Some days felt impossible. But bit by bit, she began to rebuild. She threw herself into the work she had been doing before, tending to the fields and the animals, focusing on what she could control. She didn't let the world or her emotions dictate the course of her life. One evening, As she sat by the fire, her youngest child crawled onto her lap, his little hands touching her face as he asked, "Mom, when will Dad come home?" The question broke her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. But instead of breaking down, she smiled softly, wiped away the tears that had silently fallen, and whispered, "Your father will always be with us. In our hearts. In every step we take." The words seemed hollow even to her own ears, but she knew that this was the only way she could keep going. She had to become their pillar, their symbol of strength. There would be no other choice. She began to teach her children not to dwell in the past, to honor the memory of their father, but to keep moving forward, no matter how hard the path ahead seemed. She poured everything she had into raising them, into ensuring they had a life better than the one she had known. She didn't want them to carry the same burdens she had carried. She wanted them to be free, to dream, to achieve, to live. And so, as the months passed and the seasons changed, she slowly emerged from the darkness of her grief. But it was not just the passage of time that healed her. It was the strength she had discovered in herself. A strength she had never realized she had. For she knew now that life would always bring trials, some far worse than others, but as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would never stop fighting. The days that followed her husband's death were long and weary. The grief had not entirely loosened its grip on her heart, but time, as it does, had begun to dull the sharp edges of the pain. She had learned to smile again, to speak without the tremor in her voice, and to care for her children with the devotion they needed from her. But deep inside, the woman who had once dreamed of a life beyond the village walls still yearned for something more. She had always been the caretaker, the nurturer, the one who held the world together for everyone else. But in her loneliness, she began to question, who was she now, when all her responsibilities were met and her heart had healed, if only a little? One afternoon, while tending to the small garden she had started in the backyard, she heard the familiar sound of a woman's voice calling her name. It was Sita, a young mother from the village, who had recently lost her own husband in a tragic accident. Her grief mirrored the depths of the pain she had once felt. Sita had children, just like she had, but what troubled her most was the sense of helplessness that seemed to paralyze her every day. She felt lost, trapped by the weight of her grief and responsibilities, unable to see beyond her immediate sorrow. It was a pain that echoed her own feelings after her husband's death, and as Sita sat beside her, tears in her eyes, she felt an overwhelming sense of empathy for this young woman. As Sita wept, she spoke of her fears, the fear of never being enough for her children, the fear of not being able to survive without her husband, and the fear of being alone forever. She felt as if she had lost her purpose, as if everything she had once hoped for had been ripped away by fate's cruel hand. And then, for the first time in years, she spoke up, as if the words had been waiting inside her all along. "Grief is a shadow that follows us, yes," she said gently, "but it does not have to consume us. It will change us, but it does not define us. What matters is what we choose to do with it." Sita looked at her, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. But how? How can we move on? How can we live when everything feels broken? The question hung in the air, thick with the weight of so many lives shattered by pain and loss. And in that moment she understood. She had spent so many years being the one who had to hold everyone else together. But now, she could see that her strength wasn't just for surviving, it was for living, for helping others to rebuild when they had nothing left. She wasn't just a woman who had endured. She was a woman who could help others endure, too. That night, as she sat by the fire, the flame casting shadows on the walls of her home, she reflected on what had just happened. She thought of her own pain, of the loss that had once felt so unbearable, and of the way she had risen from it. She had built a life from nothing, first as a daughter, then as a wife, and now as a mother and a community member. She had learned how to survive the worst of life, and perhaps, more importantly, she had learned how to thrive again. But what if she could help others do the same? The thought lingered in her mind as days passed, and soon she found herself drawn to the women of the village in ways she had never been before. She began to seek out those who were struggling, those who were carrying the weight of grief, fear, and loss. She listened to their stories, offering quiet words of encouragement and wisdom drawn from her own experiences. Slowly, she built a small group of women who met regularly, not just to share their burdens, but to find strength in one another. They spoke of motherhood, of hardships, and of the silent ways in which they carried the weight of the world. She didn't have all the answers, but she had lived through enough pain to know that sometimes the simple act of being heard was enough to begin the healing process. And so she became a mentor, a guide, a woman who could show others that they were not alone in their struggles. She taught them how to find purpose in the ordinary things, how to take joy in small victories, how to keep going even when it seemed impossible. She showed them that their pain, their grief, and their sacrifices were not weaknesses but strengths, things that connected them to each other and to the life they were building. At first, the women were hesitant. Many of them were like she had once been, quiet, reserved, and unsure of their place in the world. But over time, they began to open up, to share their own stories, and to realize that they, too, could be strong. They could rise from the ashes of their pain and create something meaningful from the lives they had left. In a quiet corner of the village, the seeds of change began to take root. The women, once silenced by their burdens, began to speak louder. They shared their dreams, their hopes, and their frustrations, and in doing so, they discovered new ways to live. They found strength in each other, in the simple act of being seen and understood. And she, the woman who had once been consumed by grief, found her purpose. It was not in grand gestures or in changing the world all at once, but in the quiet moments of connection, in the bonds she formed with the women around her. Her life, which had once felt so constrained by loss and hardship, was now full of meaning. She had become a force for change, not just for herself but for others, and it was in this that she found her true strength. Her purpose was clear now, to guide the women who had lost their way, to help them rebuild their lives, and to teach them that pain, though it would always be a part of them, did not have to be the end of their story. It could be the beginning of something new. She became not just a symbol of resilience for her own family, but for the women of the village, a woman who had lived through her darkest days and emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for the community around her. Through her pain, she had discovered the most profound truth, that sometimes the greatest purpose is found in helping others find their way. The seasons shifted once again, and with them came the gradual change that life often demands. The garden she had planted beside her home flourished with vibrant colors, as if nature itself responded to her newfound sense of purpose. But it wasn't just the physical world that was blooming, it was her soul, too. In the months that followed her decision to help the women of the village, something remarkable began to happen. The group of women who had once gathered quietly in the corners of the village, each weighed down by their own burdens, began to grow. What started as a few hesitant meetings soon turned into a thriving collective, a circle of women who found not only support but strength in one another's presence. The small gatherings that once took place in the shadows of their homes began to spill out into the open. They met in the village square, by the river, or in the fields during the early mornings, before the sun rose high in the sky. What started as a simple exchange of words, shared stories of pain and survival, had grown into something more profound, a bond, an unspoken agreement among the women to lift each other up, no matter the cost. She, the quiet, grieving widow, had become their leader, though no title had ever been given. She was the one who spoke with calm authority, the one who gently encouraged the others when they felt weak, the one who gave them hope when their own hearts were heavy. She had become not just a mentor, but a symbol of resilience, someone who had lived through the worst and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. Word spread quickly through the village about the changes taking place. Men and women alike took notice of the transformation happening within their families. Women who had once kept to themselves, confined by the weight of tradition and expectation, began to speak more freely. They started to take risks, to step outside their comfort zones, to create their own paths in a world that had never truly allowed them to. And through it all, She stood quietly in the background, a guiding presence. One day, a group of women came to her with a request. They wanted to start a small cooperative, an opportunity to pool their resources, skills, and labor so that they could have a means of supporting themselves independently. It was a radical idea for their village, where women were traditionally expected to work solely within the home, but she encouraged them to dream big. "We can start small," she said with a soft smile, "but our efforts will grow, just like this garden. We must plant the seeds of hope, and we must water them with determination. Let's show the world what we can do when we stand together." The cooperative began as a simple project, gathering their handmade goods, sharing recipes, and teaching one another skills they had kept hidden. Soon, it expanded into something more than just a means of income. It became a symbol of what women could accomplish when they were empowered and supported by one another. They sold their goods at the market, created goods for barter, and even began to train younger women in the arts of craftsmanship and trade. Her leadership wasn't about imposing her will on others. It was about showing them that they were capable of more than they had ever believed. She taught them that strength didn't come from physical prowess alone, but from unity, shared purpose, and mutual respect. She didn't just give them hope. She gave them the tools to make their own hope a reality. As the years passed, the village transformed. Women began to take on roles they had never before imagined for themselves, managing businesses, teaching the younger generation, and even becoming involved in decisions that had always been left to the men. And through it all, she remained a quiet, humble force, always there, always listening, always guiding when needed, but never demanding the spotlight. Her children, now grown, watched in awe as their mother became something more than they had ever imagined. They had always known her as a strong woman, but seeing her influence spread across the village made them realize just how far her impact reached. She had shaped not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around her. Her eldest daughter, now a young woman, approached her one evening, her voice filled with pride. "Mother, do you see what you've done? You've created something beautiful here. You've given them all a reason to believe in themselves." Her words were simple, but they struck deep into the heart of the woman who had once been nothing more than a grieving widow, lost in her pain. It was in that moment that she truly understood the extent of her legacy, not just the tangible changes in the village, but the lasting impact she had on the hearts of the women she had mentored, on the children she had raised, and on the community that had once written her off as just another forgotten woman. She wasn't just the woman who had lost her husband. She was the woman who had helped others rise from their own losses, who had turned her grief into something greater, something lasting. Her legacy wasn't in the field she had tended or the children she had raised. It was in the community she had helped to build, the lives she had touched, and the hope she had given to women who once believed they had no place in the world. As the years continued to unfold, she found peace, not the kind that comes from the absence of struggle, but the peace that comes from knowing she had done something meaningful with the life she had been given. She had found her purpose not in her own survival, but in the survival and thriving of those around her. The world may have never fully understood the depth of her strength, but she didn't need their recognition. The women she had helped, the children she had raised, and the village that had once struggled to survive now knew her for what she truly was, a beacon of hope, a woman who had turned her pain into a gift, and a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. The years had passed, but for the woman who had once been a grieving widow, time had only deepened her sense of purpose. She had lived through the harshest moments, yet with each passing day, she had discovered that the strength she had once kept hidden was not a solitary force. It had become a fire, kindling in the hearts of the women she had mentored, a light that continued to grow, not just in the village, but in places she had never imagined. As the decades stretched behind her, she grew older, her hair now streaked with silver, and her hands, once so strong and steady, had begun to show the signs of age. Yet, there was a certain wisdom in her eyes, a quiet understanding that only comes with the passing of time. The wrinkles that lined her face were not signs of weariness, they were the map of her life, each one a testament to a lesson learned, a hardship overcome, a victory claimed. Her children, now adults with families of their own, had moved on with their lives, but they never forgot the lessons she had taught them. She had instilled in them the belief that they could be anything, do anything, as long as they held fast to their convictions. She had shown them how to be kind, how to be strong, and most of all, how to never let life's challenges define them. Her daughter, now a mother herself, often looked to her with admiration, as if trying to understand how a woman could possess such an unshakable resolve. "How did you do it, Mama?" she would ask, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "How did you keep going when everything seemed so impossible?" The older woman would smile softly, her heart full as she gazed at her daughter's young face. "I didn't always keep going," she would say gently. "There were days when I didn't know how I would make it through. But I kept going because I had to, and because, in the end, it was the only thing that made sense. The world doesn't always make things easy, but the only way to survive is to keep moving, even when the road seems endless." Her daughter would nod, understanding in her own way, as her mother's words sank deep into her soul. The quiet wisdom, the strength, the resilience, it was something passed down not just in stories, but in the way they lived, in the examples set before them. The woman had come to understand something powerful in her later years. Her strength was not something she had hoarded for herself. It had been a gift, one that she had passed on to others, particularly to the women of the village who had once felt so small, so invisible, so unimportant. Her legacy was not just a collection of lessons or achievements. It was the way she had made others believe in their own potential, the way she had given them the courage to live lives they never thought possible. As the village grew, so too did the influence of the women she had mentored. It was no longer just a quiet corner of the world where hardship reigned. The women were no longer confined to their homes, their voices no longer silenced by tradition. They had become leaders in their own right, businesswomen, educators, farmers, healers, each carrying the flame she had ignited within them. And through it all, the old woman watched with pride, knowing that the work she had started so many years ago had become something far greater than she could have imagined. She would often sit by the fire at night, gazing out at the stars and reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the long, difficult days when she had been a young girl, lost in her own grief and uncertainty. She thought of the woman she had become, the wife, the mother, the teacher, the mentor, the community leader. She had worn many hats, played many roles, and in each, she had discovered new strengths, new depths of resilience. But perhaps the most profound realization had come in her later years, when she understood that the strength she had cultivated wasn't just for surviving life's trials, it was for helping others rise above theirs. The legacy of a woman is not in her own struggles alone, but in the way she empowers those around her to overcome their own challenges, to stand tall, and to face the world with confidence. She remembered the first woman who had come to her for guidance, Sita, the young widow who had feared she could never move on. The change in her had been one of the most profound. Sita had become a voice for the other women, a leader in her own right. And it wasn't just Sita. There were so many others, women she had once seen as lost, now standing strong and leading their own families, their own businesses, their own communities. And it had all started with a single act of compassion, a willingness to listen, a decision to help others rise. As her health began to decline, the woman knew that her time on this earth was drawing to a close. Yet there was no fear, no regret. She had lived a life full of purpose, full of meaning. The world had not always been kind, but she had faced it head-on, never backing down from a challenge, never giving up when it seemed too difficult to go on. And through it all, she had made a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of so many others. Her legacy would live on through her children, her grandchildren, and the countless women whose lives had been touched by her strength. The work she had done, teaching, guiding, mentoring, would carry on long after she was gone. Her name would not be written in grand books or etched into history's annals, but it would live in the hearts of the women who had learned from her, in the lives of the children she had raised, and in the village that had once been a place of struggle but was now a community of hope. She had done it, not by changing the world, but by changing the lives of the people in it. And in that, She had found a peace that could never be taken away. The years passed swiftly, as they often do when a life well-lived reaches its final chapter. The once vibrant woman, now an elder whose name was whispered with reverence, had become a fixture in the hearts and minds of everyone who had crossed her path. Her community was no longer the same village she had once known. It had evolved into a place of strength, unity, and hope, a place where the seeds she had sown had taken root and flourished. But as time does, it eventually claimed the woman who had given so much of herself to the world. She passed quietly one evening, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and those whose lives she had touched so deeply. There were no grand ceremonies, no loud proclamations, just the quiet, steadfast presence of the people who had learned from her, the ones whose hearts carried the lessons she had taught them. When news of her death spread through the village, it was as if the earth itself paused for a moment. The loss was felt by every single person, for she had been more than a matriarch. She had been a symbol of unwavering resilience, an unspoken pillar that had held the village together through storms both literal and metaphorical. Her children, now adults with their own families, gathered around her humble home to honor her memory. They had all known her as the strong, ever-present figure who had shaped them, but now, in her absence, they were confronted with the realization that her influence had stretched far beyond their own lives. Her children, who had been raised with her teachings of strength and perseverance, looked at one another with a sense of responsibility. They now carried the torch she had passed to them, the torch that would continue to burn brightly for generations to come. But it was her grandchildren, those who had known her only in her later years, that felt her absence most profoundly. To them, she had been a living legend, a figure of endless wisdom who seemed to have all the answers. They remembered the way she would gather them around her, telling stories of her own childhood, of struggles she had faced, and of how she had overcome them. To the young ones, she was not just a grandmother. She was a hero, someone whose strength was unparalleled. Her eldest grandson, Ollie, stood at the front of the gathering, his voice thick with emotion. He was the first to speak, and as he did, the crowd fell silent. Grandmother was more than just a part of our family. She was the heartbeat of this village. She taught us that strength doesn't come from what we can do alone, but from how we lift each other up. We are what we are today because of her. And we will carry her lessons with us, as we always have. The crowd nodded, many wiping away tears, as the realization of her lasting impact settled into their hearts. Ollie continued, I remember asking her once how she kept going, how she stayed so strong. She told me, strength is not about not falling. It's about how many times you stand up after you've fallen. And every time I've been knocked down in my life, I've remembered those words. I know now that the strength she spoke of was in all of us, and we must carry it forward. It was in that moment that the true magnitude of her legacy became clear. Her words, her actions, her spirit, they had been passed down not only to her children, but to her grandchildren as well. Ollie and his siblings would carry those lessons with them into their own lives, just as her children had done before them. In the months following her passing, the village found itself at a crossroads. There was no denying the impact she had left on the community, but how could they honor her memory? How could they ensure that her teachings, her values, would live on in a world that was constantly changing? Her children, along with the other women she had mentored, decided that the best way to honor her was not with statues or grand memorials, but through action. They formed an organization in her name, the Legacy of Resilience, dedicated to empowering women, helping them overcome adversity, and fostering community support. The organization would provide education, resources, and a platform for women to come together, just as she had done so many years ago. Her grandchildren, inspired by the work she had begun, took an active role in carrying her message forward. Ollie, who had become a teacher in the village, made sure that her lessons on strength and perseverance were woven into the curriculum for the younger generations. He would often tell the students about his grandmother, about how she had grown up in hardship but had never allowed that hardship to define her. And in doing so, he ensured that her story was passed on to children who never knew her but could still benefit from her wisdom. As years turned into decades, the impact of her life continued to echo through the village. The community was no longer defined by its struggles, but by its collective strength. The women who had once gathered in secret were now leaders, business owners, educators, and mentors themselves. The cooperative she had helped establish was now a thriving enterprise, providing opportunities for future generations to build the lives they had once only dreamed of. And it wasn't just the village that remembered her. Her story, her legacy of resilience, began to spread beyond the borders of the small community. Articles were written about the remarkable woman who had transformed her village, and women from neighboring towns traveled to learn from the example she had set. She became a symbol of what one person could do to change the world, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant their beginnings. Her grandchildren, now grown and with children of their own, gathered together one final time at her graveside on the anniversary of her passing. As they stood there, hands joined, they remembered not just the woman she had been, but the force she had been in their lives. Ollie looked down at the inscription on the stone. Her strength was not in how much she endured alone, but in how she helped others rise. He smiled, his heart full. She always said that the best way to honor someone's legacy is to live it. And I think we've done that, don't you? His granddaughter, standing beside him, nodded. We will continue to do so for as long as we live. And so, the cycle continued. The story of the woman who had faced loss, hardship, and adversity, and who had turned those struggles into a source of strength for herself and others, was passed down like a precious heirloom, one that would never be lost, never be forgotten. Her legacy, built on resilience, love, and empowerment, would live on in every life she had touched, in every generation she had inspired.